Today, I'm going to teach you how to turn a regular Polaroid photo into a unique work of art. The technique is called a Polaroid transfer emulsion lift. It's an alternative photographic process that's been around for at least 50 years and involves lifting the image off a Polaroid print and transferring it to another surface. This surface is often paper, but the cool thing is you can actually transfer the photo to just about anything, like this shelf for example. Polaroid transfers are pretty simple in theory, but tricky in execution, and there are a few bits of gear that you're going to need to get it done. A Polaroid camera is the most obvious one to start with, along with some Polaroid film. You'll also need some scissors, a tray, a plastic cup, a selection of brushes, a pipette, some gloves, and a kettle. Lastly, you'll need a surface to put the image onto, and a thick watercolor paper around 300 GSM is a good place to start. First, you want to fill up your kettle with regular old tap water and pop it on the boil. Once this is heating up, grab your Polaroid and trim off the white edges so that you are only left with the image. You don't have to trim it square either, you can cut it to any shape you want, so feel free to get creative. Once the water is boiled, you're going to pour it into the tray and pop the photo into soak. The water I'm using here is between 80 to 90 degrees Celsius or around about 175 to 195 degrees Fahrenheit. After soaking for 5 minutes, you're going to grab your glove and put it on your non-dominant hand, which will help protect you from a majority of the chemistry inside the Polaroid.
Hi, it's Future Chris here. Just a bit of a disclaimer, this water in the tray is still going to be quite hot, so be a little bit careful when you're popping your fingers into it, and maybe think about getting yourself a set of tongs to grab the Polaroid out if you're worried about putting your hands in scorching hot water. Alrighty.
Then test out the edges of the print until you find one that has a bit of give and begin the peeling process. You can't go too slowly with this step. In fact, you should aim to go as slow as possible, at least until you get a feel for the right amount of tension there should be when you're peeling. Now, there are 5 layers to the Polaroid print. A plastic front, behind which sits a clearish sort of gel layer, and then you've got your emulsion, which is holding your image, and behind that the chemistry, and then the negative. While doing the peel, one of 2 things will happen. Your photo will either stick to the chemistry on the back of the print or to the clear gel at the front. Depending on where it ends up will slightly change what you do for your next step. If it sticks to the chemistry, the emulsion will be very delicate, but it will come away quite easily. You can pop it back into your first bath, which should still be hot enough to lift it, but while you are handling it, make sure you treat it with a heap of care. I find 95% of the time, however, it sticks to the gel layer, which makes it a little trickier to lift, but it also gives the emulsion a lot more strength and structure. If it does this, you want water. Now, there is a third option, and that is that it sticks to both the top and the bottoms, and it ends up in a couple of pieces. This can feel like a bit of a bummer at the time, but don't give up on it yet, as the result often looks more interesting than if things worked out perfectly. My suggestion when this happens would be to pop the back half into your original bath and then trim the front half off with some scissors along the tear and soak this front half in fresh boiling water. For the post-peel soak, you're going to leave it for another 5 minutes to give the emulsion a chance to soften up. And after the wait, you can begin to brush the image off. If it's stuck to the chemistry, it should float away without any trouble at all. And if it's stuck to the gel layer, you might need to give it a work over a bit with the brush. This can be a little nerve-wracking, but you'd be surprised about how resilient it is. Once it's lifted, scoop it up into your plastic cup, discard the water, and fill the tray back up with some cooler, room temperature water for the final bath. Grab your piece of paper and pop this in the water along with your loose emulsion. What you've got to do now is untangle the image, and this is where a huge dose of patience is going to come in handy. Go slowly with it, using your hands and the brush to unravel the photo until you've got at least one of the edges flat. Sometimes the front of the brush, that is the side with the bristles, will catch and risk tearing the emulsion, so I'll often use the back of the brush as well while I'm doing this. Now that you've got at least one flat straight edge, you can grab onto the corners of the emulsion with your thumbs, and while holding onto it along with the paper, gently lift everything out of the water. This will get the image to stick, and don't stress if it looks like a bit of a mess now, because we're going to fix that next. Keep dunking the photo back in the water, but don't submerge the whole image, just the side that you were trying to straighten. Often the unsubmerged side will stay in place, but if the whole thing starts sliding around, you can prevent this by holding onto the edge opposite to the one you were dunking. While it's in the water, give it a shake and keep pulling it in and out of the water until you've managed to get it flat. Spin the paper around and do this for each side, and by the end you should have a perfectly flat print. If there are any particularly stubborn bits, you can also untangle things a little bit more by combining this technique with a brush, dipping the side that you're wanting to adjust into the water and moving the emulsion around with the brush and with a lot more precision. Now the tricky bits are done, give yourself a pat on the back. You can end the process here, however, in my opinion, it seems like a bit of a waste to go to all this effort just to end up with a photo that looks pretty similar to the one that you started with. Instead, I find it much more interesting to manipulate the print a bit, which you can do by brushing wrinkles into the edges, forming it into interesting shapes, or tearing into the emulsion. Get creative and see what you can come up with, and if you don't like what you've done, you can always just pour some water on top of it and straighten things up again. When you are finished, leave your print somewhere to dry, but keep it out of direct sunlight or the colours will end up changing. If the paper ends up a bit wonky, then you can flatten it out by popping under some heavy books for a while. Now, all this is well and good when things work out. However, despite having made about 200 of these in the last 6 months, I can tell you that things often go wrong. And it's been really difficult to pin down what causes the process to succeed or fail. One thing I've discovered, however, is that climate seems to play a large role in getting a good peel. When I was doing these in Europe over Christmas, although it was tricky keeping the photos warm enough to develop properly, everything worked like a dream when it came to the lift. In Australia, however, I've had a lot more trouble, and it seems like the hotter the environment is, the more trouble you are likely to have. To combat this, you want to keep your photo cold after it's been fully developed. Back home, I've had the most success in the studio by leaving the print for 30 minutes to develop and then popping it into the fridge until I want to do the transfer. And in the field, you want to take something like a cold pack with you to keep it cool. The optimal time for doing the transfer seems to be around about 1 to 24 hours. Leaving it longer than this runs the risk of the chemistry hardening too much. Even if I plan on doing the transfer straight away, popping it in the fridge to get it cold after the photo develops seems to help during the peel. And obviously it isn't always super practical to keep your Polaroid cold if you're shooting outdoors, but it does seem like no matter how long you've left the image out, cooling it down before doing the transfer helps with the peeling process. Don't ask me for the science behind this. If anyone can enlighten me, I'd love to know. I've just discovered it works through, honestly, a lot of meticulous trial and error. The longer you leave your Polaroid before doing the transfer, the more likely it is that the chemistry hardens and sticks to the back of the emulsion once it's peeled. This hardening also seems to speed up in a warmer environment, and you can sometimes brush the chemistry off while it's soaking, particularly if the Polaroid is fresh, but if it is an older photo, then the chemistry will likely be too hard, and you'll also run the risk of tearing the emulsion. While it won't completely ruin the final result if you leave this chemistry behind, you can see the marks it makes through the image after you've done the transfer, so it should be avoided as much as possible. Another thing that can happen sometimes is that the gel layer can begin to separate from the emulsion layer after you've done the lift. While this isn't a deal breaker, it can affect how clean the final result will look, and it can also get tangled and make it difficult to get a smooth finish. You can, however, very carefully peel the emulsion and the gel layers apart. Warning though, this is incredibly fiddly and it comes with a high risk of tearing. You need to use a cold water bath to first strengthen the emulsion and then go at it super slowly. With a bit of patience, you can separate them and end up with a nicer print. However, honestly, it isn't that big of a deal most of the time if you see the emulsion and the gel layer separating a bit, so I wouldn't stress about this too much unless you want to be really pedantic about things. With a bit of practice, it becomes quite easy to obtain a perfectly flat, clean transfer, and you'll likely pick this up without too much trouble. The trickier part I find is doing the alterations afterwards, like creating the creases or tearing the image. Once I get the initial transfer done, I'll set aside some water and I'll pour the rest out so that I can lay the paper flat in the tray. The emulsion will stick to the paper and tear easily if you try to move it once it's out of the water. So the trick to manipulating the print at this stage is to re-wet it, but you do so selectively on the areas you wish to change. You can do this by using your pipette to drop some water onto the edges, as well as wetting your brush, and then you'll be able to push and pull that part of the photo around without too much trouble. Sometimes if you put a lot of water on top, the changes you make won't set, but you can fix this by dabbing the area around the photo with some paper towel to soak up any of the excess liquid. You'd be surprised by how much flexibility you have to move the image around using this method, to the point where you can wet the whole image and slowly pull it around the paper if you need to reposition it entirely. With some exploration, you'll likely pick up a few tricks using the pipette and the brush, such as fixing the edges that get caught underneath the image by sliding the paintbrush under the photo and pulling the edge back out. Try roughing up the edges, tearing into the image and creating different shapes. Get creative, don't be afraid to ruin a few photos and see what kind of manipulations you can come up with. And that's how you can successfully do a Polaroid transfer emulsion lift. I'll no doubt be picking up some more tricks as I continue to create these, so make sure you subscribe to keep up with any new things we discover. Happy snapping!